Hi, everybody. This is Adam Ellenboss from Nightlight Astrology. This is another video blog. It's January 11th, 2018, and today's topic is based on some questions that I've been getting from readers and viewers. The question is, were ancient astrologers deterministic? Were they fatalists? Did they have a kind of heavy and deterministic view about reality? What's the difference between fate and destiny? And all of this and more we're going to take a look at in today's talk. So the main reason that I'm doing this talk today is because over the past week or two, especially through the Venus-Sun-Pluto transit, you've seen astrological transits play out that are very powerful. And there's been a lot of talk also circulating on the web through some popular articles that were published on modern psychology and astrology and the difference between ancient and modern forms of astrology and things like that. And overall, I've gotten a lot of emails from people basically asking the question, so, what's the difference between fate and destiny? What's the relationship between fate and free will? How did ancient astrologers think about these things? This is a vast topic, not something we could possibly hope to cover in one video blog, but we're going to take a shot and just talk about some of the dynamics today. So this is a good, anybody could listen to this talk who's curious to know, like, what have astrologers, for basically the vast majority of the history of astrology thought about fate and free will? Just some ideas to get you thinking. Now, there's not been just one thing that astrologers have thought about fate and free will. The conversation has persisted for a couple thousand years, right? So the point today is to give you some of the broad overview of what ancient astrologers thought about. So let's begin, though, with a pretty simple but sort of radical idea. In our sort of modern rational consciousness, we spend a lot of time thinking about fate and free will as opposites, as though if something's fated, it can't be free. It couldn't have been free will. And if something is free will, then there can't be fate. In order to understand the ancient philosophical conceptions of fate and free will, we have to dismiss the idea that fate and free will are some sort of hard, pure opposites. Now, you just have to sort of set that aside for a second. Fate, for example, is not the same thing throughout the ancient world, and even today, fate is not the same thing as absolute determinism, which means that for a very long time there have been connections between fate and free will existing at the same time. You don't have to believe in a completely mechanistic universe. You don't have to believe in a completely mechanistic astrology in order to believe that alongside of some element of mechanistic laws at work, there is also a certain amount of free will that's at work interacting with these laws mysteriously. And free will, on the same note, free will, in order to believe and value free will, you don't have to believe that every single thing in the universe is absolutely free. Everything in your life you don't have to believe is freely chosen. Just like you don't have to believe that every single thing is fated. Now, that's a very simple idea, but I think most people, if we're really honest with ourselves, most people exist somewhere in the middle. You have some amount of belief in fate and some amount of belief in freedom. The word fate itself is problematic. We're going to look at that today. One of the main conversation stoppers with regard to predictive forms of ancient astrology is that people don't like the word fate because fate has a kind of heavy, scary feeling to it. So we're going to talk about that as well. But I've said this in some other talks, but let's sort of zoom out for a second. What did ancient astrologers believe that they were studying? Very simple, basic idea here. It looks a little different at different times in the tradition, but in the early tradition, mystics in whether they're Taoist mystics studying the I Ching, or Indian sages studying the Vedas or astrology, or you have Western Hellenistic astrologers looking at the mechanics of the astrological system. In all of these different traditions, You have the basic human study of generally could be said to be the laws of heaven. What are the laws of heaven? It has to do with the laws that preside over what is conceptualized to be the world that we live in, the earthly realm that humans inhabit. And this is seen in sort of distinction to the heavenly world that we look out to in the skies from this ancient perspective. The planets and the celestial bodies out there are thought to be like administrators of the laws that govern the affairs on Earth. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Then we have to understand what the human realm is thought to be comprised of. For one thing, whether you're talking about Plato or Indian astrologers or the Taoist philosophers of the I Ching, major systems of divination, all of these people think, hey, the human realm is about fluctuation constantly between the opposites. What are the opposites? You have qualities, very basic, like elemental qualities that come around, like hot and cold or wet and dry. You have fluxional oppositional qualities like good and evil, ignorance and knowledge. You have pain and joy, suffering and happiness. You have different kinds of fluctuations of human emotion. And what ancient people unanimously sort of observe is that these things are, that the human realm is comprised of these different kinds of opposites all over the place. They're in constant dialogue and sort of cyclical, fluxional states with one another. And you can notice that the reason that it's so easy to jump to the idea that the heavenly bodies are governing this process is because they literally, at the most basic level, define the process. You have the sun rising, bringing life, heat, everything is growing, rising up to the top, setting, going down into the underworld, rising again. And that cycles every day over and over and over. And it accompanies and governs and sort of, in a very tangible physical sense, seems to give life to the whole project. The sun goes down, the moon comes out, the moon goes through its waxing and waning, and it also mirrors the cycles of life. It has a slightly, different role to play. But at any rate, so it's very easy to jump to this general picture of the world, the human world, as comprised of opposites fluctuating back and forth, and of the heavenly bodies above being either mirrors of, or in some ways like administrators of, these fluxional qualities that break down from the most macro things like the day and the night, the rising, culminating, and setting of planets and the stars and the sun and moon, to very, very intricate things like the moral differences between good and evil, ignorance and darkness versus clarity and light, and so forth, right? So now all of this, all of it in general, is also contrasted sharply by most ancient mystics with the realm of spirit or soul, which is thought to be an eternal, unchanging realm that is here within this realm, that this realm somehow reflects. So there's a soul in a body, there's a soul in the world, there's souls in nature, there's the world is ensouled. It has within it some sense of spiritual essence that is unchanging, divine, eternal. And you have whole worlds of theologies surrounding this basic idea. Now, the fluxional world, the sort of human world that we're dealing with all of the opposites and all of the things that really define and get us caught up in, we get really involved in this stuff. That world is sometimes called the realm of karma, samsara, maya. It's also referred to as the realm of fortune, the turning spindle of fate and fortune. There's different ways that it's conceptualized, but usually it's in terms of a cycling wheel. You have the Tao. The Tao is a picture of that wheel with the opposites fluctuating in it. You have the same thing in yoga and in yoga philosophy. You have the same basic idea with the primary and secondary motion of the sky in ancient philosophy, like from Plato, that informs astrology and so forth. So, and what is the goal of astrology? Is in some ways it is to study the laws that govern this material karma, this realm of fortune, of the fluctuating of opposites, which is thought to be predictable. It's thought to be predictable, mechanical, and in a sense deterministic and governed by laws. Now, because the soul is, like a human soul, let's say, is born into a body, and the body, which will grow and generate and then pass away, the soul is fated insofar as it participates in being in a body that is a part of this predictable mechanical situation that it's in, this realm. So astrology is originally a study of fate or karma or samsara or maya. It is a science that is trying to, a sort of mystical science that's trying to understand the operating laws of this realm. And why, but the question becomes, why do that, right? If you take a purely deterministic view, if it's all just totally mechanical, then what's the point of doing any of it? You could just as well say, well, it's all fated, so that's that, right? So there's no sense to look into it if you can't do anything to change any of it. What would be the point of looking at, if that's all you are, is just some mechanistic cycling of biology or chemistry or physical properties? What would the point be other than to demonstrate your knowledge of what's going to come? It would not be a very spiritual purpose as most of us understand spirituality. Well, remember that these different ancient mystical traditions also believed that there is a soul in the body, individual souls, or a great soul, or a world soul, or different conceptualizations of spirit, right? In contrast to matter, there's a sort of duality between the two. So why do astrology? Because the birth chart is giving you not only just a picture of your material karma, but through the study of fate, through the study of karma, one cultivates some kind of healthier, participatory, observational relationship to the realm of karma, to the realm of fate, that it otherwise is said to very easily get identified with, attached with, and lost in. Okay, so that's the basic reason for doing astrology. It's not necessarily, will I get the job? Oh my God, right? No, that's not really the point. In fact, that would be sort of an abuse of astrology from this sort of spiritual mystical perspective. If all you're concerned about is what you're going to get in the future, or what's going to happen, or what's not going to happen, and so forth, then you're clearly not getting the message in terms of not getting overly identified with this material sphere. So that's not been the point of astrology. In order to highlight this, let's read a few quotes from ancient astrologers, what they thought about astrology. Now, this comes from, if you haven't read it, I'm going to pump my colleague's book, Hellenistic Astrology by Chris Brennan. I choose to read from this book because he has a wonderful chapter on the study of fate that collects a number of really great passages from the Hellenistic source texts, all in one place. So if you want to read a really nice summary of the different philosophical views that some ancient astrologers had, his book is wonderful, as is his course on Hellenistic astrology. Here's what Vettius Valens said. The Vettius Valens is one of the famous sort of anthologizers, collects a lot of ancient astrological wisdom into one source called the Anthology. And here's what Valens said. For God, in his desire that man should foreknow the future, brought this science into the world, a science through which anyone can know his fate in order to bear the good with great contentment and the bad with great steadfastness. Accordingly, then, the initiates of this art, those wishing to have knowledge of the future, will be helped because they will not be burdened with vain hopes, will not expend grievous midnight toil, will not vainly love the impossible, nor in a like manner will they be carried away by their eagerness to attain what they may expect because of some momentary good fortune. A suddenly appearing good often grieves men as if it were an evil. A suddenly appearing evil causes the greatest misery to those who have not trained their minds in advance. He goes on and says, those who engage in the prediction of the future and the truth, having acquired a soul that is free and not enslaved, do not think highly of fortune. Now that's the realm of samsara. That's the world that we occupy do not think highly of fortune, and do not devote themselves to hope, nor are they afraid of death, but instead they live their lives undaunted by disturbance, by training their souls to be confident, and neither rejoice excessively in the case of good, nor become depressed in the case of bad, but instead are content with whatever is present. Those who do not desire the impossible are capable of bearing that which is preordained through their own self-mastery, and being estranged from all pleasure or praise, they become established as soldiers of fate. Now, Valens has his own mood and tone, but that's Valens talking about the spiritual purpose of astrology. Here's Firmicus Maternus, who, by the way, Firmicus Maternus has a very interesting story surrounding his life and a potential sort of conversion to Christianity that may or may not have played a role in his relationship to astrology. Anyway, that's a whole different story. This study will most successfully bring us to the point where our souls will despise everything which is considered evil or good in human affairs. Now, he's talking about the stuff we get caught up in. It's like, oh, that's so great, that's so wonderful, or, oh, that's so awful. He's saying right away that the soul will learn to, getting caught in either of those things gets you going in that cycle. And the cycle's nature is pain. This is the same thing that the Buddha taught. For when we learn of the approach of difficulties, we despise the threat of evils because we've learned from our doctrine about things to come. We do not shrink from dangers once foretold. By recollection of its majesty, our souls have formed themselves to withstand these things. We are not overcome by bad fortune, nor elated by promise of high office. Thus fortified by stable reason, we cannot be oppressed by ill fortune, nor overjoyed at the expectation of good. Now notice that he doesn't say you're not supposed to have emotions. He says we can't be oppressed by ill fortune, and we can't be overjoyed at the expectation of good. Here's Ptolemy. For first of all, it is necessary to consider that even for events that will necessarily result, the unexpected is apt to cause delirious confusion and mad joy, while foreknowing, this is the purpose of astrology, habituates and trains the soul to attend to distant events as though they were present, and prepares it to accept each of the arriving events with peace and tranquility. So here's Zoisimos. He's talking about philosophers and / astrologers sort of in the same camp. Hermes and Zoroaster, Hermes being one of the mythical founders of astrology, say that philosophers as a class are superior to fate, because they neither rejoice in her good fortune, for they are master over pleasures, nor are they thrown by the evils she sends, as they always lead an inner life. Nor do they accept the fair gifts she offers, since they look to an end of ills. Little simple example. One of the things that perpetuates problems with money karma that I see all the time in my practice, thousands of clients over the years that I've seen, and I've seen this pattern so many times. People get a windfall of money. They've got a really nice Jupiter transit hitting something in their second house, maybe, right? They get an influx of money. And what do they, if I were to ask them at any given point in time, like, okay, if you had money right now when they're hurting for money, what would you do? Almost always the number one thing is, I would get myself out of debt. I would get myself out of debt. Or I would take care of X, Y, and Z that feel like a noose around my neck. These obligations or responsibilities, things that I have to maintain or upkeep, things that create so much pain and labor in my life and suffering. And I suffer with these things. So if I had money, I would get that out of the way, right? And that's what people say. And then they get an influx of money, and what do they do with it? They end up spending it on something new, on something that will require more maintenance. They don't get out of debt because they feel high. They feel so high, and they assume that this good fortune will continue forever. They don't see it as an opportunity to get out of a difficult, painful situation. They see it as a promise that they're destined for more and more and more and more and more. But the truth of karma is that what goes up comes down. Most of the time, a windfall will come in for most people who aren't extraordinarily wealthy. A windfall will come in, it'll be there for a little bit, and then it'll go away. So this is exactly what these astrologers are talking about. They're noticing these kinds of patterns in nature, and they're saying that studying astrology helps you become aware of them specifically so that you don't get caught up in them. This is radical because in today's day and age, one of the things that we tend to think about astrology, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but we look at the birth chart and we say, you know, this birth chart is me. This birth chart is me and my character and my specialness. And what ancient astrologers were doing was a little bit different. They were saying, what makes you special is to build confidence, to build a sense of yourself as soul. Now, there's a lot of ways to do that, not just doing astrology, right? Connection with nature, connection with art, connection with poetry, connection and compassion with others, love, romance, beauty. There's so many ways to develop a sense of who you are as a timeless being. The astrological practice is kind of like a sort of like a scientific, mystical scientific practice. But the reason that we do it, and it's divinatory as well, it's predictive. And one of the reasons that we do it, though, is specifically to get to that same place of saying, okay, so I'm going to have Saturn in my second house of finances for the year. Here's a range of different things that's likely to entail. And now I can stay my soul in confidence so that what happens for me is already beautiful. It's already beautiful because I have a soul that can participate in the creation of meaning with those events. And that's where the freedom is. It's not, well, I'm going to cultivate I'm going to cultivate myself to be able to manifest the results that I really want in the material world. For ancient astrologers, that would have been largely delusional. Now, not to say that there weren't people who were interested in trying to use astrological knowledge for the sake of selfish or material gain. I'm just saying for these mystics and what we just hear them saying, that's not part of the picture. All right. So again, if you haven't read it, great book on Hellenistic astrology by my colleague, Chris Brennan. I just pulled those quotes from his book. I have all of the source texts right over there on my shelf from the Greek Hellenistic era, translated by Robert Schmidt for the most part, and they're replete with very similar kinds of reasoning. Now, so that's how ancient astrologers were conceptualizing fate, the world, the role of astrology in some way, and the soul and its relationship to the material realm. Now, let's talk a little bit more about, in the West, there's another famous passage from Plato. This comes at the very end of the Republic, which is one of Plato's famous texts. You probably have read Plato before, like the allegory of the cave, where you have the realm of karma, samsara, very adequate, like very sort of brilliantly described by Plato, with the prisoner who's in the cave, not really even knowing that they're sort of chained to the rocks, and they're looking at a wall where there's shadows on the wall. They think that that's all that there is, right? For the people, for the souls that don't have knowledge of themselves as an eternal being, Plato's creating a really nice analogy here, a nice allegory. There's a sense in which when you get lost in the material world, you get really overly identified with it, then you think that the shadows, these are shadows that are passing and flickering and changing all the time. They're not constant. They're fickle, and you get lost in them. You think that you think that this is reality. Now, again, unanimously, mystics have talked about this. So Plato's guy in the cave is looking at the shadows on the wall, and he gets stuck with them, and until one day he sort of starts to question, what is their nature? What is their source? Where do they come from? He ends up getting out of his chains to find that there's a fire casting light, creating the shadows, right? And it goes from there into a beautiful story. That's Plato's outlining the same path of mystical spiritual development for the philosopher that astrologers are outlining vis-a-vis the study of astrology. You study astrology to understand the nature of the shadows. By understanding the nature of the shadows, in contrast, the nature of the soul starts to draw to itself an awareness of itself within this world. It's not necessarily about rejecting this world. Some of the traditions are really super like, let's just get out of here. Let's just hightail it out of this crappy realm. There's other realms. There's spiritual realms. Other traditions are about saying, no, this is heaven. It's just that if you get lost in the shadows, then it's hell. right? So there's different conceptualizations of the relationship between the soul and this realm that different traditions have had. We can't talk about that today because that would be way too much. But at least we now have an understanding of what ancient astrologers were doing. Now, one of the main reasons I'm passionate about educating people about this is because, in my view, very unfairly, there's a lot of people who believe that ancient astrology, because it's more predictive, because it's more of a study of science, the science of karma and samsara, right? This is we then project backward onto ancient astrology purely because of its predictive nature and because of our tendency to dichotomize fate and free will. We think, oh, those old astrologers were just really fuddy-duddy fatalists. They were just deterministic. They're not nearly as evolved or enlightened as we are. In some ways, I guess I protest what that seems to me like a modern dogma. Why is it a dogma? Because it's not understanding the way that ancient philosophers conceptualize the relationship between fate and free will in the first place. Instead, it's insisting that we hold them accountable to our very modern view of fate and free will, which we see as things that are dichotomized. And what's more, we also really, really privilege free will. And we're also largely, and this is again just my opinion, we're very materialistic. We think that freedom means freedom to do or get things in the material world that we prefer, right? And so astrology in that context should be about possibilities. And we should be able to always have a nicer interpretation that we like. We shouldn't say anything bad about the future. But this is malarkey if you think about it. You're going to have an uncle who dies. You're going to have bad years of finances and good ones. You're going to have kids born. You're going to have miscarriages. You're going to have breakups. You're going to have falling in love. It's all there. And if astrology is what traditionally astrology was not something to be able to give you a bunch of possibilities to be excited about. It was traditionally to help you prepare for the seasons of life so that whether it's good or bad, you're still cultivating that. You can't have intimacy with the world, deep, real intimacy with the world, unless there's something in yourself that you're cultivating to have intimacy with the world in the first place. If you don't cultivate that, then you're not going to be having intimacy with the world. You're going to be on a roller coaster, up and down, up and down, up and down. So I don't believe every modern astrologer at all works like this, but there is a trend of being unfairly pessimistic and sort of nasty toward ancient astrologers as if they're outdated and unevolved and so forth. And I think that to push back against that, we have to say, no, it's not quite that simple. We really have to study our ancient philosophy. And we also have to understand that we're placing a premium on free will now in the material world. And that, at worst, is a form of spiritual materialism because it's materialism cloaked in spiritual language. Now, we could have deep, interesting, difficult, debate about all of this, but this is the place that I'm coming from. So now let's take a look at, I was just mentioning Plato. The myth of comes at the end of the Republic. Here's some of what he says at the end of the Republic. This is the last part of the Republic, the myth of I'm going to read you a brilliant summary that I will place. I'll give you the link to. You can find it online. It's a good summary, but here's my copy of Plato's complete works. This is my favorite edition of Plato because Plato has a lot to say, and it's good to have a lot of his different material available in one place. I love this edition, which in turn was recommended to me by Becca Tarnas, who's a wonderful scholar and astrologer. Anyway, so I've been working with this edition of Plato for a while now and really enjoying it. So if you're looking for a good complete works of Plato, he's really important to study a little bit, and he's much more accessible than people think that he is. There's some stuff that's really difficult, but a lot of what he has to say is really accessible. Anyway, here's the myth of and here's a kind of summary of some of the main points that I find really handy. Okay, so in preparation for the reincarnation of the soul, this is what's being depicted in the myth of the soul chooses a daimon or like a deity, a spirit that will guide the soul through the life. Okay. This daimon, by the way, if you want to read about the presence of this daimon in a really modern psychological context, James Hillman's book, The Soul's Code in Search of Character and Calling, is all about fate and calling and the daimon in modern psychological language. It's a wonderful book that can also make everything I'm about to say much more accessible in more modern language. Anyway, we have this guiding deity that we choose at the beginning of the life, and usually people don't remain very conscious of it. It takes a certain kind of mystical cultivation to be aware of or to have a more conscious relationship with your guiding daimon, right? So that, first of all, that's important. And Hillman says as much in The Soul's Code as well. A lot of people, they don't know their daimon very well. And not every daimon is necessarily a good daimon either. Some people hang out with life guides that aren't necessarily like the greatest. Anyway, as this goes along, you choose a daimon or deity, and then you're led to the spinning wheel or spindle of the Greek goddess Necessity. Okay, so here's where we're getting into this kind of the understanding of fate in astrology. According to Plato, the spinning wheel or spindle of necessity was comprised of one outer wheel, the zodiac, the 12 signs, and then 7 inner wheels, which are the planetary spheres. In Greek mythology and tradition, the goddess Necessity had 3 daughters. I'm always going to slaughter their names: Lachesis, Clotho, and Atropos. I don't know if I say Lachesis correctly or not. The 3 sisters were together known as the Fates. So first of all, it's interesting. We think of fate as very singular, right? And maybe in some ways fate is like a general concept, but for the ancient Greeks, the fates would have been plural. That's just something to think about, and feminine as well in some way. Now, okay. So the outer wheel is the zodiac, then 7 inner wheels, which are comprising the heavenly spheres. The goddess Necessity has these 3 daughters. They're known as the Fates. Lachesis, meaning she who allots, measures the thread of fate. Clotho, meaning weaver, weaves the thread of fate. And Atropos, meaning implacable, unbending, and unyielding, cuts the thread of fate. Now, in this myth of basically, Lachesis is said to be busy with the signs and planets, Clotho with just the signs, and Atropos with just the planets. Now, that you could really get into this and try to break it apart and analyze. It's really interesting, and I've spent a lot of time with this, but I'm going to try to keep it really simple today. Lachesis is associated and is singing. They're all singing. Singing of the past. Clotho is singing of the present. And Atropos is singing of the future. Each soul approaches Lachesis first, the past. This is very common also in different forms of Eastern philosophy, that your past lives and past actions are a major part of how the next lifetime is chosen. So there's karma involved here. There's laws at work. There's a kind of momentum or gravity that is pulling the selection of the next life along. Okay, and then they go to Clotho in the present, and then Atropos, who is the future. So they go from past to present to future, visiting the 3 sisters of fate as the life is sort of woven together prior to birth. When the souls had all finished choosing their lives, this is Plato speaking now, they approached Lachesis in the order the lottery had assigned them. She gave each of them the personal deity they'd selected to accompany them throughout their lives as their guardians and to fulfill the choices they had made. Each deity first led its soul to Clotho, the zodiacal signs, to pass under her hand and under the revolving orbit of the spindle. You have to remember that the sky itself is mirroring this turning all the time, this wheel of karma, this turning by the primary motion, by the secondary motion of the planets. Plan to do a video on that sometime as well. It's a very interesting topic. Anyway, each deity first is led to Clotho's zodiacal signs to pass under her hand and under the revolving orbit of the spindle, and so to ratify the destiny the soul had chosen in the lottery. Now, the lottery is an important part of the story as well. It's not total chance, but there is an element of chance involved with the way that lifetimes and the fate is chosen. The soul chooses. There's a very important understanding that the choice of the soul is not just a material choice. There are choices that the soul makes that are in spiritual realms or dimensions that are not purely material. It's very important, because the soul's freedom is not the same thing necessarily as material freedom. Well, I can go and choose to eat a bowl of cereal right now, and that's a certain kind of material freedom. The soul's freedom is not the same as that kind of freedom, or at least it doesn't always have to, it's not necessarily the same as that freedom. Once a connection has been made with her, Plato says, the deity led the soul, Atropos, now Atropos is the planets, and her spinning to make the web woven by Clotho fixed and unalterable. Afterwards, the soul set a fixed course for Lady Necessity's throne and passed under it. All right, so that's a process that Plato's describing in what he says is a myth. It's the myth of Ur. So, but this is a kind of another allegory for Plato of the process of the soul and reincarnation and its relationship to astrology. Now, here's a translator talking about some of the astrological references. When the souls had all finished choosing their lives, they approached Lachesis in the order the lottery had assigned them. She gave each of them the personal deity they'd selected to accompany them throughout their lives as their guardians and to fulfill the choices they had made. So the soul makes choices, right? That it is coming here to fulfill. And often, the simple point is that often we think a fated event vis-a-vis the prediction of an astrological reader is heavy, or like, oh my God, like I don't want to believe in fate. But the important thing to remember is that ancient astrologers believe that what we experience as material fate is something that is part of the soul's choosing. The soul chooses things not necessarily because it's the brightest, bulb in the bunch. The soul is, you could say that every soul has its own personality. From this standpoint, there's no necessary reason that the soul is going to choose something that's just totally amazing and beautiful. That's not to say that the soul doesn't continue to learn, but we all have the experience of sensing that there's a soul contract. There's no problem. Like most people, and even in modern astrology, who detest the idea of predictive astrology, don't have a problem with the idea that whatever happens to you in life, somehow your soul chose, which is a total contradiction philosophically if you think about it. If the soul chose it, then what's the harm in being able to predict it? Usually it has more to do with delivery. People are averse to astrological prognostication being delivered in a way that's harsh, punitive, unsensitive, undiscerning, thoughtless, and so forth. Anyway, so let's go back a little bit. Now, she gave each of them personal deity they'd selected to accompany them throughout their lives as their guardians and to fulfill the choices they had made. Each deity first led its soul to Clotho, zodiacal signs, to pass under her hand and under the revolving orbit of the spindle, and so to ratify the destiny the soul had chosen in the lottery. Then once a connection had been made with her, the deity led the soul to Atropos, the planets, and her spinning to make the web woven by Clotho fixed and unalterable. That's the conceptualization of a birth chart. Afterwards, the soul set a fixed course for Lady Necessity's throne, etc. Now, the word ratify in the Greek was associated with the ruling of a planet. The word for destiny later came to mean the degree on a zodiacal circle. So there is, in this myth, there is a ruling planet that approves, sanctions, or authorizes a specific degree on the zodiacal circle. And this is most likely referring to either what is sometimes referred to as the sort of chart administrator, which there's different techniques of calculating, or probably more likely the rising degree of the chart, which sets the whole chart and fixes it. So every child is given a specific degree of the zodiac that will be, each soul given a specific degree that'll be rising at the hour of birth, and that fixes the birth chart. So the guiding daimon or deity is assigned to that particular degree of the zodiacal circle. That's fascinating. Just think about that for a second. Places a lot more emphasis on the rising sign. Remember, in modern astrology, we place a ton of emphasis on the sun sign. Sun sign astrology is a relatively newer thing. There are different predominant degrees and important things that are considered by ancient astrologers. Not to say one is necessarily right or wrong, but these are big differences. Now, the author here says, as for the uncomfortable word unalterable, Waterfield, that's one of the translators of Plato, points out that in Plato's other writings, Plato leaves room for change in each person's life. It is only the broad framework which is fixed. The whole of Plato's philosophy leaves much room for self-improvement within that framework. So in other words, Plato is not a hardcore determinist, even though he's laying out a certain kind of ratified fate, destiny that the soul chooses and is born into through a specific unalterable birth chart. Now, then what happens is all the souls travel to the plane of oblivion, located next to the river of neglect, and each soul is required to drink a certain portion of the water that will cause them to forget their past life or lives. But some people in the myth drink more than they had to. Now he says, let's see here. Now, Plato has some ideas about how souls reincarnate that I would take issue with. Like, for example, just to be totally honest, well, if you had made less wise decisions, you could step down and be reincarnated as a woman, right? I mean, like, that's awful, right? So there are elements of Plato's philosophy that are truly like, there's things about ancient philosophy and the ancient, the way that the culture was, is that we're not ever encouraging anyone to just become purists about, we're not trying to return to ancient Greece, right? So that's a problem. Indian philosophy has similar problems. There's similar built-in prejudices in some of the ways that reincarnation is conceptualized. Now, that doesn't mean we should throw it out altogether, though. Okay, so at any rate, now, so the horoscopos, the word horoscopos in Greek means the hour of birth, and it's likely, again, that the specific degree that's being sort of ratified in this myth is the actual rising degree of the chart. So at any rate, that is a little view of Plato. Let's talk now about the difference between fate and destiny. Now hopefully what you've gotten, what I've given you, is a sort of survey of what ancient people were thinking about fate and what they were thinking about reincarnation and the soul, what they were thinking about the purpose of astrology, what they thought about the material world. And they're not unanimously saying the same things. Their theologies and metaphysics are different. They evolve, they change, but that basic, these are the most general things that they had in common. Now, when you look at it, then here's some of the things that we have. We have the belief that the soul has a kind of choice that is not the same thing as material choice. We have the idea that even within the material world, there's a certain amount of freedom within the parameters of fate. That's all part of what some ancient astrologers believe. There are more deterministic ancient astrologers, and there are more, you could say, sort of astrologers that give more leeway for choice. Also, we have the belief that real freedom, the real kind of freedom that you want, is found in using whatever material free will you have to cultivate the life of the soul. So the real use of free will is not to go out and get your best job, get your best wife, get your best car, get your best whatever, get your best body. That the real use of free will is to cultivate the life of the soul. And I again, me personally, I don't believe there's just one way to do that. Astrology is one of many different ways to cultivate the life of the soul. Hillman, who's wrote prolifically about the life of the soul, talked about having a relationship to dreams, romance, theater, film, art, friendship. I mean, there's so many ways to cultivate the life of the soul. It's not just a religious endeavor. However, most of these ancient philosophical traditions believed in mind-body practices like yoga, like meditation, contemplation, solitude, breathing, chanting, you name it. There's most of these traditions have at least meditation in common. Meditation allows you to get some distance and to see the fluctuations within yourself from the perspective of an observer. So most of these traditions have placed a high premium on meditation. Now, some people also mistakenly believe that ancient Greeks were just philosophers, that they had no mind-body technologies or practices, which is not a great thing. That's actually not true. Hold on just a second. This is another great book if you want to read about the connections between Eastern mysticism and Greek mysticism, early Greek thought. This book right here, Universe and Inner Self in Early Indian and Early Greek Thought. Fantastic collection that blows away the idea that ancient Greeks were just up in their heads. And there's probably so much transmigration of mind-body philosophies and practices between East and West that are not totally understood yet. There's another great book, The Shape of Ancient Thought. That book is also about the connection between Eastern and Western philosophy and mind-body practices. Anyway, okay, so many yogic traditions and other mystics have made similar claims. Here's another similar claim that runs throughout the history of astrology, ancient astrology. For example, from Ibn Ezra, who is a sort of medieval Jewish mystic, an astrologer. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, for it is the instruction. That's interesting. Now, when ancient people say the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, right there, that's quoting the Proverbs, the Bible, the Proverbs. But that verse is frequently misunderstood. People say, I don't want to believe in a terrible, fearful God. This is more about humility of the heart. We're talking about having a humble heart before, something that's tremendously bigger than ourselves. That's a holy kind of fear. It's the kind of fear that Saint Francis has, or Mother Teresa in the Christian tradition. It's the kind of fear that Sri Ramakrishna talks about. It's prevalent among all different kinds of mystics and saints to be in deep reverence and to make sure that you feel small in light of something bigger than yourself. Not to say that you're not connected to that bigger thing, right? But in modern times, we like to dichotomize it. Oh, well, if you feel humble, that must mean you think of yourself as less than God. And so we inflate notions of oneness with God to compensate for the ego, who does not want to be diminished in the face of anything bigger than itself. I'm not saying there's not, there's not a oneness, but we have to be very careful, because one of the ways that ancient astrologers said that you also found more freedom in life was through remaining humble in relationship to the divine. So here's what he goes on to say. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, for it is the instruction, the wisdom needed to guide you through this realm of karma. That if you stay in a position of gratitude, inner sort of smallness, you don't let your ego get so big, then you can receive instruction. For when a man does not follow his eyes and heart to fulfill his worldly desires, then wisdom will rest inside. Moreover, the fear of God, let's just call it humility, will protect him from the laws and ordinances of the heavens all the days of his life. And when his soul separates from his body, the fear of God within him will endow him with eternity. So all of these traditions, whether it's heaven or enlightenment, are also talking about the idea, most of them, that the soul can discover an enlightened state. Now, some people conceptualize that as something taking place right here. There's jivamuktas, enlightened beings within bodies. Other people see it as merging with a transcendental source. Others see it as entering a heavenly realm in this unending, amazing personal relationship between the soul and God. Whatever. To me, that's not the point. The point is that you have yogis in different traditions. You have Jewish mystics in different traditions say the same thing. Stay in a humble, loving relationship with the divine, and the divine will guide you, and has the ability then. The providence can then interact with your fate or destiny to protect and guide you. Now, you can't approach it like it's a contract. Like, if I pray, then you're not hiring a bodyguard. You're not paying a bodyguard money by means of your devotion or practice, right? You're actually giving your heart in full trust, just like you're trusting your fate, you're trusting your destiny, and so forth. But in this case, you're also trusting that if and when it might be appropriate for God to intervene, that God can intervene. And one of the quickest ways to enlist that help from divine beings, or from God, or from your angels, or whatever, is to stay close to those beings, to God, and so forth. You don't just get down on your knees when something bad is happening, right? You try to stay connected all the time. And that that offers you the instruction. So it is true to a certain extent that you can navigate a Saturn transit. And it is true to a certain extent that your ability to navigate that transit more constructively for the sake of the soul, not for the sake of getting a car or something, but for the sake of the soul, is that you stay close to the divine, that you stay close to, you cultivate that relationship. Okay, so that's a whole nother perspective. Take it or leave it, but that's another perspective that works with the dichotomy between fate and free will. Now, the last thing is to point out that sometimes people say, "Oh my gosh, I'm really I'm not liking this fate stuff because fate is such a heavy word. Can we come up with a different word for it?" Well, I'd just like to read you guys the etymology of the word fate and destiny to show you how interchangeable they really are. Fate, one's lot or destiny, predetermined course of life, but also one's guiding spirit. We also have, associated with the etymology of fate, prophetic declarations, oracles, and predictions. We have things spoken by the gods. We have a sort of divine spoken ordinance from above. So fate is conceptualized by Plato as a choice that the soul makes. There's choice involved, a kind of spiritual choice that's not necessarily the same as material choice. And we also see that fate is a divine. There's a divine language that's being spoken in the fate of our life. There's a guiding spirit involved with the word fate. Now, contrast that with destiny. Destiny, people generally think of destiny as better. I have a destiny, right? Sounds more like affirming. Fate sounds more, I'm resigned to this. I've got to accept this, right? It feels heavier. But both actually mean something like ordinance. Destiny means purpose, intent, and fate, that which is destined. It comes from Latin, and in the Latin, the etymological roots mean to make firm, to establish. Okay, so destiny is a way basically of saying, to break it down simply, when we say destiny and we like that word better than fate, it's because destiny assumes that the soul, the consciousness of the soul, is saying, yes, that's my destiny, I chose it, it's mine, I accept it, I love it. Okay, so there's something in the word destiny that is actually a little closer to the idea of making firm within the heart the commitment to the life that we're here to live. Everyone loves that, right? Everyone loves that. But what we forget is that fate basically has the same meaning, right? So fate or destiny are two very interchangeable words. We shouldn't be so afraid of fate. Because I'm obsessed with the show right now. Watch the show Vikings. Balin said, we will be established as soldiers of fate. This is an old view that why be afraid? Why be afraid? The soul can't die, right? I can't die. What I am cannot die. It wasn't born. So what am I afraid of? Why am I afraid of anything? Now I know that can lead us to some crazy territory of sort of spiritual bypassing or checking out of like reality and responsibility. But that's not the point of the recognition that the soul is eternal. The Vikings in the show have this sort of warrior's attitude about fate. I'm not afraid to die. Okay, I think I'm back. We had a little disruption here. Why would that be bad? That would be, I'm going to Valhalla, right? Like there's a deep acceptance of fate. I'll conclude with this, if I can get it. Okay. Here it is. The beloved Lord said, now this is from the Bhagavad Gita, this is Krishna talking to Arjuna, who's hesitant to go into a battle and fight, but it's his fate to do so. It's his dharma to do so. So Krishna says to him, he's grieving. Arjuna doesn't want to fight. He's grieving, and he's trying to say to Krishna, isn't there a different way? Isn't there another way? This is a horrible thing to go and have to experience this. Beloved Lord said, you have grieved for that which is not worthy of grief, and yet you speak words of profound knowledge. The learned grieve neither for those who have passed on, nor for those who have departed. Never truly have I ever not existed, nor you, nor these kings who protect the people, and never shall any of us ever cease to be, now or forevermore. Just as the embodied while in this body passes through childhood, youth, and old age, so also the embodied attains another body. The wise person is not bewildered by this. Certainly, contact of the senses with matter, which results in cold, heat, happiness, suffering, comes and goes, and it's impermanent. You must strive to tolerate this, Arjuna. Indeed, the person whom these do not trouble, O best among persons, the wise one for whom suffering and happiness are the same, that one is prepared for immortality. Of the impermanent one finds no being, one finds no non-being of the permanent. Indeed, the certainty of both of these have been perceived by seers of the truth. Now, know that to be indestructible, by which all this is pervaded, no one is able to bring about the destruction of the ever-present. These bodies, said to have an end, belong to the embodied which is eternal, indestructible and immeasurable. Therefore, fight. So, we'll close there for the day. I thank you all so much for being here. I'm just looking to see if there are any questions. Let's see. Fate sounds more masculine, where destiny sounds more feminine. I actually believe it's the reverse, right? There's reasons for that, but that's interesting. Destiny has a feeling of like, it's not happening to me unless I choose it, which I think of as more masculine, whereas fate has a more natural feeling to it. This is the way of nature, and I think of the deep acceptance of nature as very feminine, but that's just me. I mean, there can be a lot of debate about this stuff. Let's see. I recommend Mapping the Psyche, Volume 3. Yes, that's all 3 volumes are very very good. Liz Green's whole collection is really good. Necessity is the mother of invention. I like that. I will be at UAC this year. Yeah, I'm giving a talk on the 5th house during one of the lecture series. Let's see, any other questions? Questions for the end. What are your thoughts on the traditional treatment of houses, configurations of the ascendant house, angularity, and planetary joys versus the modern 12-letter alphabet approach? Can the two coexist? Thank you for your... Yeah, so actually I'm going to be doing a talk on that. That's in my list. That's in my queue of talks. So I'll set aside that for another time. But suffice it to say that I don't have a lot of love for the 12-letter alphabet. I think it's something that should be discarded. I believe it's filled with interesting like symbolic correlations, but overall I don't think it's a good thing to use in our practice. That's just me though. Let's see. This is a realm. This realm is a school for the soul. Yeah, a lot of people have said that before. It certainly seems to make sense. And someone else asks, am I taking apprentices? Yeah, so I offer private apprenticeships and big group classes. My class is called Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. You can learn more about that or the private apprenticeships that I teach on my website. I'm going to put those in now, nightlightastrology.com, if you want to learn more about me or the stuff that I do. And here is also the website that I was pulling from for a really nice summary of the myth of Ur. And once more, here's the books, Universe and Inner Self in Early Indian and Early Greek Thought. Oops, The Soul's Code by James Hillman. A nice version edited by John Cooper of Plato's Complete Works. I read initially from Hellenistic Astrology by Chris Brennan. Another fantastic course on ancient astrology. And I also read from the Bhagavad Gita by Graham Schweig. I think that's how you say his name. Oh, and I read from The Beginning of Wisdom by Ibn Ezra. Thank you, everybody, so much. Take care. Bye.